What is art?
Art is
history.
What is art? That's a good question.
This is Art Uncovered.
Art is our collective cultural history.
A weekly podcast that brings you interviews with an eclectic mix of artists and creators.
Art is
disappointing your parents.
I'm your host, Kimberly.
I think about what it is to see and what it is to perceive and what it is to sort of live in a hyper schematized reality where our ideas of what things are more present than our ability to see things for what they really are. How we view people is often a sort of character of a person before we really connect with a person. And I think that is a kind of damaging and difficult way to exist in reality.
That was the voice of my guest this week, Michael Ambron, who's a New York-based artist and paint maker whose work is rooted in the visual phenomena of daily experience. Over the course of the conversation, we talk about Michael's interest in meditation, his visual exploration of his experience with sleep paralysis, and his paint-making business, Paint Maker's Notes. Stay with us. Welcome back, listeners. Thanks again for tuning in to this week's episode of Art Uncovered. This week, I'm so honored to be here with Michael Ambron. Michael, welcome to Art Uncovered. It's great to have you.
Hey, Kimberly, thanks for having me.
Yeah, of course. So Michael, you're a painter, you're a printmaker, you're also a paint maker, which I definitely want to talk about at some point during the conversation. But to start, I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about something that I read while researching your work. The quote was, and I forget if it was from an artist statement or an article or something like this, but you said that you approach your work with a meditative intention, which I think is a really beautiful way to phrase your practice. So I'm wondering if you could maybe talk a little bit about your relationship with meditation, how it intersects with your art, things like this.
Yeah. So I started practicing meditation maybe 20 years ago or so. And it just started as a kind of curiosity, mostly breath work, a little bit of transcendental meditation. I was just kind of testing things out and trying to see what it had to offer, because I felt like a lot of the experiences that I was having were not necessarily shared by all the people around me. And I thought maybe this would be a good way to get a better sense of what was going on in my sort of perceptual experience. And I think the biggest benefit of having a sort of creative practice that incorporates meditation has been the ability to turn off the thinking. I think it's when you're making, you're not necessarily analyzing the work. And so it's good to have that division between the two tasks. And so a lot of it is really in the studio. I feel like I'm able to purge a lot of the thoughts and get things out, things that are on my mind, things that are concerning me about world events or situations that we're in. And there is a lot of noise, I would say. First, it's like I take a meditative approach, I think, because I need that approach in order to sort of get to a place of calm.
How long does it usually take for you to get to that place of calm?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think it varies depending on how sort of fragmented or out of sorts I feel going to the studio. Sometimes there's like that cathartic release where you're just with the canvas and the materials, and it's almost like an outburst of emotion or movement or whatever it might be. And then you feel calm immediately. And instead of painting, you might end up just sitting and observing for a while or just doing some breath work. And then other times it kind of comes on unexpectedly through repetitive mark making or patterning, where you realize that you've stopped thinking and you don't know how long you haven't been thinking. You're just sort of beautiful, following the line and the marks. And that's kind of an addictive experience.
Yeah. I'm curious, what kind of techniques do you use to be able to turn off the thoughts? You mentioned like just mark making, but is there any thinking to help you get rid of the thoughts, which seems a little...
I think I'm pretty sensitive to sound. So in addition to like the marks being visually represented, the sound of the canvas being like a drum has a very calming effect on me as well. So even if I'm continuing to make marks and I go past the border of the canvas onto the floor, onto a box, onto the wall, I don't have to distinguish like, oh, I need to stop now because that's the edge. I kind of just let it play out until it reaches back to the next appropriate point. And then also just counting the breath is something that, as boring as it often seems, and I have to constantly sort of like reinvigorate that practice for myself. I'm just constantly reminded that the counting actually is one of the most useful tools for turning off thinking.
That's great.
It's an abstract form. It allows you to just take the content out and just say the word and have the instinct of sequence without the sort of repetition or flow of conscious thought.
Is there any point in your practice where you do turn your thoughts back on, like to analyze the work that you made, for example?
I do. I kind of try to put that off as long as I can. Either it's at the very beginning where I need to sort of think through things, maybe scrawl out some words on the blank canvas, and sort of have a moment to purge, or at the very end, when I feel like the canvas is no longer calling me back to it, and that's when maybe I'll stop and look at it. But while I'm in it, I try to, if I feel like it's unfinished, I try not to look at it directly. I try not to photograph it. I don't want to turn it into an image or schematize it too early. One of my professors when I was an undergrad and a great painter, Donna Nelson, told us how she would close her eyes and then run full speed down the hallway to her studio and kick the door open to see the painting fresh for the first time. And I just love that idea.
That's so good. That's so good.
Yeah.
Yeah, I love the idea because I find myself doing that. Like if I make an object, especially like I photograph it from all angles and then I get obsessed with looking at it and finding the things that are wrong with it. And then I go back and end up reworking it. And I liked it way better before I even touched it. Yeah, that's really interesting. You gave a sense of time there. You said that when you're done, then you kind of turn your thoughts on to analyze. And I'm curious if when you say done, is it when you're finished with a painting, or at the end of each studio session you kind of turn the lights on and try to figure out what it means? Or do you even do that, right? I mean, not every artist has to. Yeah.
I usually it's when I feel like the painting is done, and that can be a difficult thing to discern. There's definitely times where a painting has been finished and I just can't see it, maybe because of the practice of not allowing myself to really engage with it analytically. And then there's also this kind of thing that I've discussed with other artists who have a similar kind of experience where it's like you time travel a little bit. Like sometimes you make a painting that the rest of your body of work has not sort of caught up to yet. And so sometimes the painting is finished and then you wait 6 months, a year, and then come back to it and realize why you were going into that direction. And you can sort of see the connections from your current work.
Have you ever felt pressure, I guess, especially in art school to, talk about what it means, or I guess the analyzing phase of art making?
Yeah, definitely.
How did you respond to it?
Yeah, in undergrad, I was a little bit reluctant to talk about some of the impetus or the content, because I wanted to be seen as like a decent artist, as undergrad, thinking like, oh, I'm going to prove myself on the merit of the work. And so I didn't really talk much about the sort of personal, intimate connection to perception. And a lot of my early exploration into perception was sort of revolving around these repeated sleep-induced hallucinations that I was experiencing from like the age of 16 till present day.
Oh, wow.
And so I've made entire bodies of work, and I just didn't want to say that it was that, because I didn't want to pigeonhole the work. I didn't want it to only be seen as this sort of hallucinatory experience, but I genuinely wanted to bring people into that experience somehow. I wanted to know if the painting could evoke something or help people connect in some way. to something that other people around me weren't really describing as happening to them. And then once I actually did start to talk about it, I had all these people coming up to me and saying, I've had the same experience, or I
Wow.
woke up paralyzed and there were shadow people in the room. And I was like, oh my God.
Is
So
it sleep
now I'm pretty
paralysis what you're
open to it.
talking about?
It's sleep paralysis, and then it's hypnagogic and hypnopompic hallucinations. And so
What is this?
um, it's like it's kind of like you're hovering in an in-between stage of sleep, between like the waking state and this twilight state of sleeping. And it coincides with paralysis. So I'll open my eyes, and for many years it was shadow figures walking around the room.
That's so
Um,
scary.
it was very scary at first.
Yeah.
After like the 10th time, you start to get used to it, and you can kind of like, again, back to like the breath practice.
Yeah, yeah.
The easiest way to get through that is like to calm yourself and just breathe and wait for it to pass,
Mm.
or to like focus all of your attention into one finger. If you can move one finger, sometimes you can break the
Mm.
paralysis.
Mm.
Um, in recent years, I've developed the ability to make sounds. So my wife will wake up and sort of shake me, and it'll break the spell.
Yeah. And
Um,
what is it when your mind wakes up before your body or something like this? Because yeah, you don't have the ability
yes,
to move. Yeah, yeah, it's so
it's
scary.
either your mind wakes up first, or your body goes to sleep first. It's
Mm,
this sort of
mm, mm,
disconnect between mind and body.
mm,
Um, but sometimes it's pretty disorienting. Often I feel pretty lethargic on days that I experience that. But
mm.
there have been like rare experiences where it's really beautiful. I woke up one time and saw a web of diamonds suspended in the window, and they were like a gray, translucent, concentric diamonds, and they were sort of breathing, and it felt like they were pulsating.
Wow.
And I assumed I was paralyzed, but I made the attempt to get up and realized I could move. And so I sat up, and usually if I can move, the shadows or the imagery will just dissolve into the space. And this time it didn't. It persisted for about 30 seconds. And I stood up, I walked up close to it, and it was still there. And then it slowly
Wow.
dissolved. And
Wow.
it was really kind of amazing and hard
Yeah,
to
it sounds
describe. And
sounds. Did
I
you turn
wish
that
it was
into
always
a
like that.
painting?
I definitely made work about that. Yeah.
Yeah, 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 that's amazing. Yeah, I'm curious. So you use the word perception kind of when talking about your work. And I'm curious because while looking into your work, I made note of a couple of your titles here. Let me see if I could pull them up. Okay, so some of the titles of your paintings, one is named Dilation, another one's Looking Glass, Your Eyes Are Flowers, I Think I See, Reflections, Behind the Eyes. So I'm sure you notice some kind of pattern there with
A little pattern.
the
Yeah.
the act of seeing or the tools that one uses to see. Yeah, can you talk a bit about those title choices and how it relates
Yeah.
to your interest in perception?
Yeah. I think I'm very interested in how we talk about what it is to see something. Um, there's like the act of visualization, there's the act of absorbing through the pupils, there's the sort of hallucinatory or generative experience. Um, when I was younger, I experimented more with psychedelics. And so the things that I saw in those states of consciousness um, were very similar to the sort of hypnagogic, hypnopompic, hallucinatory states. Um, and so I think about what it is to see and what it is to perceive and what it is to sort of um, live in a hyper schematized reality where our ideas of what things are more present than our ability to see things for what they really are. How we view people is often um, a sort of character of a person before we really connect with a person. And I think that is a kind of damaging and difficult way to exist in reality. And so a lot of what I'm thinking about with the titles is like, what does it mean to bear witness? What does it mean to have a genuine experience? Um, and how do we describe that? And is it a physiological thing? Is it a psychedelic experience? Is it something spiritual? Is it something, deeply personal? And so a lot of it is derived from that.
Do you come to any answers, or is it more about just kind of accumulating the questions?
That's a great question. I often think of the paintings as being interrogative. I don't know that I'm standing up and declaring that this is how it is, but I do feel like there are moments that feel real or that feel truthful in the painting. I think maybe that's also why I'm a little bit reluctant to grab onto image, because I think in many ways image is extremely reductive, and the sort of abstract experience, the felt experience, the sort of overabundance of feeling sometimes is best expressed in the movement of the body or of the brush or of color.
I'm gonna do a screen share here. Can you see
Oh, yeah.
my screen here?
Yeah, I
Just
can see.
yeah. So you mentioned there that you kind of what was the word that you used? Something the image you don't use the image, or I forget, you used a much better word than I did.
Oh,
But your work is largely abstract, right?
oh yeah, yeah.
Yeah. We have some references to, actually, maybe they're all completely abstract. When I was looking at this work, like some of them look like they could be like children's drawings. Some of
Yeah.
them look like they're just like material experimentation. But you
Mm,
have kind of a couple of different, what I would assume are styles, but I'm curious if you
mhm,
think about your work in terms of stylistic choices.
mm. I really don't think about style much at all. I think it is more about the experimentation and the sort of call and response of materiality. Dilation is that first image on the top left, the sort of brown and orange.
That's great.
That painting was made in a completely dark room. And so dilation relates to the fact that my eyes are fully dilated. I'm grasping at whatever photonic information is present in that space. And then also allowing my eyes to sort of um, have this sort of like delicate film of the imagined reality that's, our imagination, our sort of projection onto a dark room. Um,
So
and so, yeah,
there was
sometimes
no light in this space when you
there
made
was
it.
there was one very dim light facing
Wow.
away from the painting in the back of the space, and then
Wow.
that allowed me to sort of respond to what sort of photonic information or
Hmm.
phosphenes or whatever was in that environment, and then also to sort of just trust that if I was seeing things, that they should carry the same weight as the sort of physical data that was actually present. And so finding
Very
that
cool.
balance.
Yeah, and this one so listeners, I forgot to mention, sorry, if you're listening to this episode on Spotify or Apple Podcasts, I encourage you to check out our YouTube so you could take a look at Mike's work. We have some screen shares going on here and just some visual references for what we're talking about. This next one up here is Shadows of Shadows. Was this one done in the light?
That was done in light. Yeah,
Yeah.
that was I laid down so one of the things that I experienced during paralysis is red light in the upper right corner of my consciousness, sort of at the periphery, and then blue light on the left side of my visual field. And
Wow.
oftentimes the red light uh, it will sort of project as objects or kind of like cartoon images that will glide across the ceiling, for example, or when they come to the corner where the wall meets the ceiling, they might actually come down the wall. And I was sort of fascinated that these non-physical forms were conforming to the architecture of the environment. Um, and that I think sort of led me into this interest in something that seems non-physical, having a shadow, having a sort of relationship to an environment. Um, and so this painting was mostly made with layers of string that were laid down and then powder coated with a black hematite ground, and then going back in and sort of adding in shadows beneath the shapes.
Yeah, I'd like to maybe talk about some of these materials. So hematite, cellulose, it seems like a bit of chemistry there.
Yeah, a little bit.
Yeah, and I mentioned at the beginning of the episode that you're a painter, but you're also a paint maker. In a recent show that you were in, I think it closed in March or something like this at Ortega y Gasset Gallery in New York, who we absolutely love. So shout out to them. But as part of the exhibition, I think you did was it a paint making workshop?
Yeah, we did 2 paint making workshops on
Okay.
the final day of the show.
Cool, cool. Yeah, so I'm curious about your process of making paint. So do you do it commercially or just for your own work, or how does this work?
Both. Yeah,
Okay.
I started experimenting with paint making about 20 years ago, and um, I've been doing it ever since in various forms. But in the past 2 years, I have been doing it professionally. So I provide paints for some professional artists in New York, California, Chicago, Philadelphia, and that's my primary business at the moment. And then
Wow,
I
that's so
also,
cool.
yeah, I also offer some consultation to artists to help them uh, see creative projects through and maybe ask questions about what could be possible with materials. So I do a lot of experimenting in my own work. So I have a lot of sort of raw data there where I can say, like, I've done this for 10 years and it works like this. And then I also just read a lot of conservation articles and paint making articles and try to test out modern methods and see what works best. But
Wow, that's
yeah.
so cool. Is any of this stuff toxic to be around?
Sometimes, yeah. I
Yeah.
try to avoid working with like lead and cadmium and arsenic based
Yeah,
pigments.
good, good, good.
Yeah, I do occasionally process cadmiums. They're a lot safer today than the stuff from like the 70s and 80s. But in general, there's so many safer options available today. And new pigments are being produced every year. So it's pretty wild
That's
to have
great.
access to new color every year.
Yeah, that's great. What's the name of your business?
It's called Paint Maker's Notes.
Paint Maker's Notes. And can artists like just go on a website and purchase some of their own?
You can go on paintmakersnotes.com
Okay.
and just reach out and tell me what you're interested in doing. And then I'll
Cool.
usually correspond by phone or by email. And I do a lot of private sessions with people where they'll come to the workshop and learn to make paint. It's behind me. I wonder if I can rotate so you can see the station.
What? Oh my gosh, it's like a little lab. That is so great.
Oh,
Oh
yeah,
my gosh, that's amazing. I have your website up here. Oh, you have workshop here. I'm gonna do another screen share. Let's see.
sure.
Okay, here we go. So paintmakersnotes.com. That's the website that we're currently on. So you have workshops that you offer.
Mm.
This is
Yeah,
very
I offer
cool.
workshops. I had to take a break from workshops because I've had a lot of requests for private sessions, so that's been taking
Good
up
for you.
every week. Yeah, it's actually really great to work one on one,
Yeah.
um, and to just
Oil
see
paint
all the
making.
amazing stuff that artists are coming up with. So I learn a lot from talking with them as well.
Wow, this is amazing. So what would it entail to make your own oil paint?
It's the most basic is just pigment and oil. You would use one of 3 or 4 drying oils: linseed, walnut, poppy oil, and sometimes safflower is used. Safflower takes a really, really long time to dry. And from what I understand from conservators, there are paintings that are 300 years old that still have wet safflower oil in them.
No
So
way! Shut
I don't
up.
often recommend that, especially if you work thick. Um, but yeah, it's interesting how I just read an article from Natural Pigments recently, and they were saying how historic processes actually made more durable paints, and the sort of mechanized paint making is leading to sensitization of various pigments like ultramarines and zincs to water and volatile solvents. And so heavy machinery might allow you to make a lot of volume and do interesting things, but it's not actually the best way to do it.
Wow.
Grinding it by hand, the sort of blood, sweat, and tears is actually the better method.
That's so awesome. Do you make a lot at one time? Because I can imagine how laborious that process would be if you're like large scale paintings.
Yeah, I guess I get orders for like gallon buckets,
Okay. Wow.
more or less
That is
weekly. So
that
it
is
is a
so
lot.
cool. Very
Yeah.
cool. So paintmakersnotes.com listeners, I'll include a direct link on our website. I'll also link to the website on social and of course Michael's own art website. Michael, thank you so much for sharing your practice with us and these services. Very exciting.
Thanks so much for having me.
Thanks for tuning in. My guest this week was Michael Ambron, a New York-based artist and owner of the paint making and art consultation business, Paint Makers Notes. Please be sure to tune in next week as I will be speaking with Amy Ritter, also a New York-based artist who for 7 years has documented mobile home parks, over 50 sites in 17 states. Her ongoing work explores her white working class family's experience living in a double wide trailer and her family's connection to the American dream. Hope to see y'all then. Have a safe week. Bye-bye.